The small town bar was nothing remarkable. A weathered sign hanging above the entrance and a few dim neon lights flickering against the twilight. For Chris Matthews, a decorated war veteran who had just returned home from deployment, this unassuming place felt like a haven. Chris had no grand plans for the evening. He wanted a quiet drink, a moment to clear his mind before facing the whirlwind of reintegration into civilian life. Parking his old truck in the gravel lot, Chris stepped out into the crisp North Carolina air. He glanced at his reflection in the truck's side mirror. A lean man with a strong jawline, streaks of silver in his once dark hair, and eyes that had seen too much. His uniform, though simple, bore the marks of service, scuffed boots, faded patches, and a creased name tag. But tonight, he paired it with sneakers, opting for comfort over formalities. His outward appearance was modest, but inside, he carried a reservoir of discipline and resolve. Chris pushed open the creaky door of the bar, stepping into a space filled with soft chatter, clinking glasses, and the nostalgic hum of an old jukebox playing a country classic. He scanned the room. A couple of regulars hunched over a game of pool, a few solitary figures nursing beers at the bar, and a small group laughing near the dartboard. It wasn't bustling, but it wasn't dead either, just the right kind of busy for someone wanting to blend into the background. Finding a corner table, Chris settled into a chair that allowed him to observe the room without being too conspicuous. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a gruff exterior but kind eyes, approached and asked what he'd like. "Just water," Chris replied, earning a quizzical look but no argument. As he sipped the cool drink, his thoughts wandered to his family. He pictured his wife's warm smile as she prepared his favorite dinner, his teenage daughter teasing him for not keeping up with the latest trends, and his toddler's excited squeals as she'd cling to his leg. These were the moments he'd fought for overseas, the moments that made every sacrifice worthwhile. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he envisioned their reunion. But Chris's peaceful reverie was short-lived. The door swung open with a loud bang, jolting the room into silence for a moment. A group of 6 bikers strolled in, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The leader of the pack, Max, was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and a loud, booming laugh. His leather jacket was adorned with patches proclaiming loyalty to a veteran biker club. While most of the bikers seemed jovial, Max's sharp eyes scanned the room, landing squarely on Chris. Chris noticed the group, but gave them little attention, sipping his water and tuning into the jukebox instead. However, Max wasn't about to let the newcomer go unnoticed. He leaned in and muttered something to his crew, prompting a ripple of chuckles. Their glances toward Chris were anything but friendly. The tension was subtle but unmistakable, like the stillness before a storm. Chris could feel their stares, the weight of unspoken words pressing against him. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged based on appearances, but tonight it felt different, heavier, more deliberate. He remained calm, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who had faced far greater challenges than a few unwelcome glances. As the bikers settled at the bar, their laughter grew louder, their words sharper, and the uneasy atmosphere began to take shape. Chris stayed composed, though his instincts sharpened. He had come here for peace, but something told him this night was about to test the very resolve he had spent years building. Chris kept his focus on his water and the soft hum of the jukebox, but the growing murmurs from the biker gang at the bar were impossible to ignore. Their laughter, coarse and deliberate, echoed louder than any other sound in the room. It was the kind of laughter designed not to amuse, but to provoke, a challenge wrapped in bravado. Chris had seen this before, in countless forms, in countless places. It was the sound of men trying to prove something. Max, the leader of the group, leaned against the bar, his burly frame commanding attention. His sharp gaze flicked toward Chris once again, narrowing as if sizing him up. With a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, he muttered something to the man next to him, a wiry biker with a jagged scar running down his cheek. The man glanced toward Chris and chuckled, shaking his head. Chris felt the weight of their stares, but he didn't flinch. Years of military training had taught him the value of calm in the face of tension. Still, he couldn't help but be reminded of the countless times he'd faced prejudice and suspicion, both in uniform and out. This wasn't new, but it didn't sting any less. One of the bikers, a younger man with a patchy beard and restless energy, finally broke the growing silence between their group and the rest of the bar. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying across the room, "nice sneakers, soldier." The words were dripping with mockery, and they hung in the air like a taunt waiting for a reaction. Chris didn't bite. He didn't even look up. Instead, he took another measured sip of his water, his movements deliberate, his demeanor unshaken. But his lack of response only seemed to embolden the gang. Max's smirk grew wider as he turned to fully face Chris. "What's the matter?" he said loudly, his gravelly voice cutting through the quiet. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too busy playing soldier to answer?" The bar patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. The bartender, who had been quietly wiping down glasses, paused and glanced toward Chris, his brows furrowing in concern. A few regulars near the pool table shifted awkwardly but stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. Chris finally looked up, his calm, unwavering gaze locking onto Max's. For a brief moment, the bar seemed to hold its breath. "I'm just here to enjoy my evening," Chris said, his voice steady but firm. It wasn't an apology, nor was it an invitation for more. Max chuckled, shaking his head. "Enjoy your evening, huh?" he said, leaning closer as if testing Chris's resolve. "See, that's the thing. A guy like you, dressed like that, you make people curious, makes us wonder. Are you really what you say you are? Or are you just here looking for attention?" The tension in the room grew thicker, pressing down on everyone present. Chris straightened slightly in his seat, his calm demeanor unchanged. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he said, his tone unyielding but measured. "I know who I am." Max's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "Oh, you know who you are, huh?" he said, louder this time, as if trying to rally the room to his side. "Well, I know what I see, and what I see is a guy trying too hard to play the hero." The laughter from the gang resumed, louder and harsher now. Chris felt the familiar churn of anger in his chest, but suppressed it with practiced control. He wasn't going to stoop to their level, not yet. Still, he couldn't ignore the unmistakable shift in the room. This was no longer just a verbal jab. It was a gauntlet being thrown, and Chris knew the night was about to take a darker turn. The air in the bar grew heavy, the laughter from Max's gang piercing the silence like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. Chris remained seated, his expression calm, but his senses were on high alert. Years of service had taught him to read situations like this, to sense when words were teetering on the edge of action. Tonight was no exception. Max pushed off the bar, his boots thudding against the wooden floor as he strode toward Chris's table. The other bikers followed a step behind, forming a semicircle around him. The chatter in the bar fell to a whisper as all eyes turned toward the brewing conflict. Max stopped a few feet away, towering over Chris's seated form. He crossed his arms, a smug grin etched across his face. "So, you're just going to sit there, huh?" he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Don't you think it's a little disrespectful, coming in here dressed like that and pretending to be one of us?" Chris slowly set his glass down and leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I'm not pretending to be anything," he said evenly. "And I'm not here to start trouble." Max's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "Not here to start trouble," he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, here's the thing. Trouble's already started. You show up in that uniform, wearing sneakers, no tags, and expect us to just take your word for it? Doesn't add up, buddy." The other bikers chuckled, their laughter filling the room with a low, menacing hum. Chris's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't take the bait. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said firmly, "and I'm not here to prove anything to you." Max took a step closer, leaning down so his face was level with Chris's. His breath, heavy with the stench of beer, invaded Chris's space. "Maybe you should," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Because right now, all I see is a fake trying to play soldier, and if you're not going to prove me wrong, maybe I'll have to make you." The room went deathly quiet. The bartender's hand hovered near the phone, ready to call for help. A few patrons shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between Chris and the gang, but no one dared to intervene. Chris exhaled slowly, his composure unbroken. "I'd think carefully about your next move," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undeniable edge. "You don't know me, and you don't know what I'm capable of." Max's grin faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, unwilling to show any sign of weakness in front of his crew. "Oh, I think I know enough," he said, reaching out to grab Chris by the collar. But he never got the chance. In a flash, Chris moved. His training kicked in, swift and instinctual. He sidestepped Max's grab and caught his wrist midair, twisting it in one smooth motion. Using Max's own momentum, Chris turned him around and pinned him against the edge of the table, his arm locked firmly behind his back. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds, but it left the bar in stunned silence. Max let out a strangled cry of pain, his earlier bravado dissolving into panic. The other bikers froze, their wide eyes darting between their immobilized leader and the man who had just effortlessly subdued him. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the soft hum of the jukebox in the background. Chris leaned in slightly, his grip firm but controlled. "I told you to think twice before starting something," he said quietly, his voice low and authoritative. "You made a mistake." From across the room, one of the bikers took a hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Hey, man," he stammered, "just let him go. He didn't mean nothing by it." Chris glanced up, his calm gaze cutting through the tension. "He came at me," he said, his voice steady. "You all saw it. If he wants to leave this bar in one piece, he needs to calm down." The bartender, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing unease, finally spoke up. "Maybe it's time for all of you to leave," he said, his voice firm, "before this gets worse." Reluctantly, Chris released Max with a controlled shove, sending him stumbling forward. Max clutched his arm, turning to glare at Chris with a mixture of pain and fury. "You'll pay for this," he growled, but the strength in his words was gone. His crew hesitated, unsure whether to back him or cut their losses. The tension in the bar reached its peak as Max stumbled away from Chris, clutching his arm. His face burned red, a mixture of pain and embarrassment washing over him. The rest of the gang stood frozen, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. They had expected Chris to cower, to fold under pressure, but instead, they were witnessing a calm, calculated response that none of them had anticipated. "You think this is over?" Max snarled, his voice strained. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of fraud you are." He turned to one of his crew and barked, "Call the cops. Let them deal with this imposter." One of the bikers, visibly shaken, fumbled with his phone. "Yeah, we've got a guy here impersonating a soldier," he stammered into the receiver. "He attacked my friend. Yeah. Hurry." Chris stood still, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the bar's collective gaze on him, but he refused to let the moment rattle him. He had faced far more dire situations in combat zones. This was just another test of his composure and character. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing louder as they approached the bar. Red and blue lights flashed against the windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. The murmurs of the patrons grew louder, a mix of unease and curiosity. When the door finally swung open, two police officers stepped inside. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a stoic expression and a shorter, sharp-featured woman whose observant eyes scanned the room. "We got a call about an altercation," the male officer said, his voice calm but commanding. "What's going on here?" Max wasted no time pointing an accusatory finger at Chris. "That man assaulted me," he said loudly, his voice thick with indignation. "He's wearing a fake uniform, pretending to be a soldier." The officers turned to Chris, their expressions neutral. "Sir," the female officer asked, "is that true?" Chris shook his head slowly and met her gaze. "No, ma'am," he said, his tone steady. "This man and his group confronted me without provocation. When he tried to grab me, I defended myself. I have proof of my service if you need to see it." The female officer nodded. "Do you have identification or documentation with you?" Chris gestured toward the duffel bag at his feet. "In there. You're welcome to check." The officer retrieved the bag and carefully opened it, pulling out a neatly folded uniform adorned with badges, patches, and Chris's name and rank. She examined it briefly, then nodded to her partner. "It's authentic." The male officer turned back to Max, his expression hardening. "From what I've heard and seen, it sounds like you're the one who instigated this." Max's face twisted in outrage. "You're just gonna take his word for it?" he spat. "He could have faked all that." The female officer stepped closer to Max, her tone firm. Enough. You're lucky he's not pressing charges against you for assault. If you want to pursue your claims, you can, but I'd advise against it. False accusations can have serious consequences. Max opened his mouth to argue, but quickly shut it again, realizing he was cornered. His crew shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The officers filed a report, warning the bikers to leave. One by one, they shuffled out, their earlier confidence replaced by humiliation. The female officer turned back to Chris. "Thank you for keeping your cool," she said. "We'll make sure this is documented properly." Chris nodded. "Thank you, officer." As the door closed behind the officers, the bar began to buzz with quiet murmurs. Some patrons glanced at Chris with newfound respect, while others seemed lost in thought. The bartender walked over, offering a small nod. "Thanks for handling that the way you did," he said. "Most people wouldn't have kept their composure." Chris gave a faint smile. Sometimes composure is the only weapon you need. The following morning, the events at the bar lingered in Chris's mind as he worked in the driveway of his modest home just outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Chris tinkered with his old pickup truck, tightening a bolt under the hood. Despite his calm demeanor the night before, the confrontation weighed on him. Not because of the physicality of it, he'd faced far worse in combat zones, but because of what it symbolized. It wasn't the first time Chris had been judged unfairly, and he doubted it would be the last. Still, the incident was a stark reminder of the ignorance and hostility that some people carried with them. As he adjusted the engine, the sound of tires crunching on gravel drew his attention. He straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag, squinting toward the driveway. A motorcycle rolled to a stop, the engine cutting out as the rider dismounted. It was one of the bikers from the bar, Dan, a wiry man with thinning hair and a weathered leather jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. Chris recognized him immediately, but said nothing, waiting to see what he wanted. Dan hesitated for a moment, his helmet in one hand, his posture awkward and almost apologetic. Chris, right?" he said, his voice quieter than Chris expected. Chris nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "That's right. What can I do for you?" Dan stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing down at the gravel before looking back up. I came by to apologize," he said, the words tumbling out quickly as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. "For what happened last night. It wasn't right." Chris raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued but his tone steady. "You were part of it." "I know," Dan admitted, his face flushing with guilt. "And I should have stopped it. I should have said something. But Hank's got this way of riling people up, and I just went along with it. Doesn't make it right, though. I've been thinking about it all night, and I wanted to tell you I was wrong." Chris studied him for a long moment, gauging the sincerity behind his words. Dan's discomfort was evident, but so was his effort. It wasn't easy for someone like him to admit fault, especially to a stranger. "Why now?" Chris asked, his voice even. "What made you change your mind?" Dan shrugged, glancing down at his boots. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because, seeing how you handled yourself last night, it made me realize how wrong we were. You didn't deserve any of that. Nobody does." Chris leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. He had heard apologies before, some genuine and others hollow. This one felt different, not because of the words themselves, but because of the effort it took for Dan to show up at all. After a pause, Chris nodded. "I appreciate you coming here. It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start." Relief washed over Dan's face as he exhaled. "Thanks, man. I mean it." He climbed back onto his motorcycle, pausing before starting the engine. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back at Chris, "you earned my respect." Chris watched as Dan rode off, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. The incident at the bar had been an ugly reminder of the prejudice that still existed, but Dan's apology was a glimmer of hope. It was a small, meaningful step toward understanding and growth. As Chris returned to his truck, he reflected on the past few days. He knew the fight against ignorance wasn't over, but he also knew that his actions, his composure, and his integrity had the power to shift perspectives, one person at a time. The evening air was calm, the distant hum of cicadas blending with the soft rustle of leaves. Chris finished his work, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes the battles weren't fought overseas, but right here, at bars, in homes, and within hearts. And as far as Chris was concerned, those battles mattered just as much.